Welcome to Sisters in Sobriety. And today we are super excited to speak with Sahaj Kaur Kohli. She's a therapist, a writer, a speaker, and founder of Brown Girl Therapy, the largest mental health community for children of immigrants. Her book, But What Will People Say, explores identity when growing up between cultures. And she's also host of the podcast So We've Been Told, where she has candid conversations and dissects the narratives that immigrant families pass down. So today we're going to talk about bicultural identity through the lens of drinking culture, through authenticity, and the deeply personal experiences of shame and guilt in mental health. Welcome, Sahaj.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. And so just so you know, sometimes I treat the podcast like my personal therapy. So
Let's do it.
I just drop a bunch of like, well, what do you think about this? But what got you interested in this topic in the first place? Like, other than you yourself are a brown girl.
I mean, that's really it, honestly. I feel like I have lived between cultures and worlds my whole life. I'm the first in my family to be born in the West. So navigating those differences in cultural norms, there was no roadmap. And there is no roadmap, for figuring out aging and life transitions and getting older and making different life choices that might be different from my parents or elders. And about 6 years ago now, I was choosing to get married to a white American man. I was choosing to switch careers. I had been in one career. I was turning 30 and I decided to switch to a totally different career, go back to school. And I was having a lot of personal and professional kind of identity crises. What do these choices mean? Am I a bad daughter? Am I saying no to my Indian heritage if I marry someone of a different race, culture, background? Am I good enough? Am I making my ancestors proud? It was very existential for me. And that's why I started Brown Girl Therapy, because I was like, there's no way I can be the only one having these thoughts. But at the time, there wasn't anything like Brown Girl Therapy that existed. And so I really wanted to fill this void and find community for myself, because community is kind of the essence and the motivator behind everything I do. And fast forward 6 years, I'm a therapist now, an author, a columnist at the Washington Post. I have the first and largest mental health community for adult children of immigrants. And I'm just really passionate about infusing culture into these mental health conversations. I mean, even as a therapist, I was trained from a very Western individualist lens. And there is so much about our mental health from a cultural lens that we do not talk enough about.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into it, but when my therapist says things like, "Do you want to set some boundaries with your parents?" I'm like, that's not a thing.
Yeah.
Try setting boundaries with my parents.
Yeah.
It can be seen through a cultural lens for
Yep. And that's
sure.
the work I do with my clients. I am a practicing individual and couples therapist. And, the work is around what's a different word than boundary? What's a different approach we can take? Because even that term doesn't feel right. A lot of my clients just are like, they tense up when we talk about boundaries. So I'm like, well, the concept of boundaries you relate to, but it's the word. So let's find a different inroad. Some people like to use I talked about this in my podcast, but we have stories from people who said, I would use the word compromise, or I would use the word limits, or I would think about a window versus a door. I would think about dotted lines instead of a hard line that I'm like drawing with my family. And so there's different ways to explore these Western concepts, and we can bring it into the culture in a way that feels good to us while also having these relationships with other people.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you say that, like the dotted line. That would be really helpful. My sister-in-law, my ex-sister-in-law, who is my co-host, usually is a therapist, and she will say things like, she's like, I think it's time to like put some, restrictions around. And I was like, this is why you're divorced from my brother, okay? Because you cannot put restrictions. And she tried this with my parents. She tried setting boundaries.
Yeah. And it's not that boundaries are bad. It's just the approach to it is
Right.
different. It's very different.
But I do like the term compromise. I think that is something I could say to my parents and that they would resonate with them in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the authenticity piece, we were talking really briefly before we got started. So you've talked about why telling children of immigrants just be authentic can be harmful. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I've been actually sitting with this concept for a really long time and hope to do more work on this topic of authenticity. But, it's interesting because I think everyone has these narratives of what inside themselves of what it means to be an authentic version of themselves. You know, what does it mean when I am being real, when I'm speaking my truth, when I am choosing myself, when I am showing up as my whole self, right? There's all of these kinds of narratives we all have because of society around what it means to be a real quote unquote version of ourselves. And when I think about that, I get really tense. Like I feel it in my body because I'm like, well, I'm not the same version of myself at work as I am with my partner, as I am with my family, as I am with my friends, as I am in the Indian community, as I am in an American environment. Does that make me an inauthentic person? Or am I someone who's adapting and adjusting to different circumstances and different environments? And that is what is allowing me to show up as different versions of myself, but every version of myself is a real version of myself. And so, you know, specifically for people who are bicultural, like live between cultures, I don't really love the word authentic because I think it puts the onus on the person to feel bad if they are not showing up as the same version of themselves in different environments. But the truth is that if we think about being bicultural or multicultural, it's as simple as thinking about individualism versus collectivism, right? Neither is bad, neither is better than the other, but they're different. One says, choose yourself, sometimes at the expense of other people, take care of yourself, you know, do what's best for you. And the other one says, focus on the roles you play, focus on your family, your community, other people, sometimes at the expense of yourself. And those narratives are so contradictory that if you are moving between these cultural environments, of course you're going to be a different version of yourself in them because what is prioritized. And I don't think that showing up as different versions of yourself makes you inauthentic. I think it's just different. And so on top of that, I think there's a layer of like being someone who lives in a hyphenated identity, right? I'm Indian American, I'm South Asian American, I'm Punjabi American, whatever you want to call me. I have these different identities that I hold. And so what does it mean to be authentic in those identities as someone who's bicultural? You know, what does it mean to be Indian enough or cultural enough or American enough when I am living in both of these identities at the same time all the time? Authentic to whom? Who gets to decide that? Who gets to gatekeep and weaponize these identities and decide for me that I'm enough in these identities? And I think that that is a personal exploration. It's a personal decision. We are all enough in these identities, but for some reason, there's these metrics and these standards and these kinds of moving goalposts that we're all trying to attain to feel enough and authentic and real.
What do you say when people feel like, okay, well, I feel like I'm misleading my parents because I'm this different version. I really want to unify the version that I am in the outside world. Do you think that it'll just lead to somebody feeling even more fragmented, or do you think there's a way to sort of unify it? When I was younger, I was a different person at home, right? Cool.
Mhm.
So how can people start to unify it a little bit in a reasonable way?
Do you still feel like a different version of yourself at home
No.
with your parents or family? Then okay.
So I would say that I'm not misleading anyone. If I omit certain things, that's different. I would say when I was younger, I was closer to lying in one scenario, and now I'm adapting, I think, in a healthy adaptation.
So that's yeah, so that's really the key, right? Is like understanding how much of it is like active lying, like just telling
Yes.
complete untruths in order to show up in an environment versus just hiding parts of yourself that don't feel safe to come out in that environment. I don't think the hiding parts of yourself that don't feel safe is inauthentic. Because I think that's a safety and protective mechanism, right? I also think you're making a good point that at 18 when you're or 17 or 16 when you're living under your parents' roof and maybe you're beholden to their roles and their financial contributions to your life and whatever, of course, there's more at stake for you to kind of fit into their version of you versus someone who might be older and gets to say, I don't need anything from you. I now get to show up more as myself because of that. So I think age plays a really big role in how comfortable we are in bringing out parts of ourselves in different environments. I think there's a values and like discernment section, like part of this that we need to explore. Like, I think that someone might be, you know, queer and not feel like they can tell their parents
Mhm.
they're queer. And so they might feel like they're leading a double life because they don't know how to tell their family that they're queer. Some people might look at that and say, wow, that person's really inauthentic. How can they hide that from their family? But again, it goes back to safety, it goes back to cultural context and values. of fear of rejection, fear of vulnerability, fear of being ostracized. And so I think in those moments, I think it's better to reframe it as, instead of saying, I'm being, excuse me, I'm being inauthentic because I'm hiding this part of myself, we can say, I'm practicing discernment and choosing which value I'm honoring right now. And so, maybe your values conflict and maybe you say, I really value honesty, but I also really value family harmony and my family. And when those are conflicting, sometimes we have to choose which one we are willing to honor in a given situation. It's not always going to be the both for some people. I'm not saying that's the case for everyone, right? But that's where the Western messaging comes in and says, well, cut them out. They're toxic. They're not good for you. And I don't completely agree with that. I think every individual gets to decide for themselves when they want to show parts of themselves to people. It is not always safe. And I don't just mean physically safe, you're going to be physically harmed. I mean psychologically safe to show up as yourself.
So when I remember, if I could have hid getting divorced from my parents, I would have, except it was like physically impossible.
Yeah.
But I would say I was 44 when I was getting divorced, 43. And I was surprised at the amount of growth that they had shown, right? I used to think that they were incapable
Mhm.
of change. And this was going to be you need to work it out, go figure this out. And they weren't. They said, what he has done is unacceptable, and we're going to move on here. And so, how often are you seeing now the immigrant parents actually starting to like embrace some maybe more Western philosophies? Are you ever surprised?
I hear stories in the community about this all the time, right? At this point, I talk to thousands and thousands and thousands of children of immigrant over the course of my career. And I think every family is different and every set of parents is different. Every parent is different. I will say that I've been surprised about my own parents. My dad and I go on father-daughter trips now, and we had a really bad relationship when I was growing up, but now he's apologized for things. We've been able to talk about things, and I never in my life thought that was something that would happen, and it's incredible. Um, so yeah, I do think parents can change, people can change. I practice as a narrative therapist. So I'll say this. What that means is that I work with my clients to challenge the stories that they tell themselves about themselves and other people in their life. Basically, we all kind of walk around with this story of who we are, who we're supposed to be. That comes from family, from culture, from dominant society, from relationships, from experiences. And we have stories about other people in our lives, especially like long-standing relationships, our parents, our siblings. If you're have been with the same partner for a really long time, we kind of have these stories of who they are, who they're supposed to be, who they're going to be. And so, as a narrative therapist, part of my job is also challenging those stories. Where did the story come from? And are we actually reinforcing a story that doesn't need to exist anymore? So when someone says, "Oh, well, I already know how my dad's going to respond if I tell him this," then sometimes I'm like, maybe he will respond like that. But also now you are reinforcing a story without actually knowing if that's how he's going to handle it. So instead of saying, okay, now go tell him and see what happens, we'll prepare for it. So that's where discernment comes in. Maybe it's not comfortable to tell him right now because you're not ready. But then how do we prepare you for maybe finding the right way to tell him, the right time to tell him, how to prepare for the conversation, how to feel like physiologically grounded when you do have this conversation, setting that kind of up as best as we can. So then maybe we can allow him to show you who he really is. Maybe he will have that same reaction you thought he would, and that's unfortunate, or maybe he'll surprise you. But sometimes we have to give ourselves and other people around us an opportunity to be different and to evolve and to grow. It doesn't mean it always happens, right? I hear stories from people in the community all the time who say, my parents not changing, they're rigid, they're inflexible, they will not change when it comes to this one issue. I cannot talk to them about it. And that's really unfortunate. We can't change people, we can't control people. But then I hear other people say, "Oh my gosh, I tried again in a different way, and my mom really surprised me." So sometimes it's the way we talk about something, the inroad, the circumstance, where they are in their lives, what they're dealing with, how we talk about it. The curiosity we show to their feelings about the topic. All of these things that can change the dynamic of the relationship.
Yeah. What's interesting, so my parents were very accepting of the divorce, but months later, when my grandmother died and I was at the funeral, they said my husband was at work.
Mhm. Yep.
So Do you find
That's
that
why I named my book, But What Will People Say? Because there is a
yes.
very real concern of what other people are gonna say, family reputation, and we have to think about it from a survival lens, right? We especially from a cultural lens, like immigrants, children of immigrants, we are coming from families and people who, because to survive, had to care about what other people think. They had to care about what their bosses were gonna think, even if there was discrimination in the workplace, because they needed to maintain that job to survive, to feed their family. They needed to care about the community, maybe back in India, because it was tight-knit, it was small, and if you got ostracized, you would lose a lot, right? You'd lose resources, you'd lose relationships, you'd lose reputation, you'd lose everything. And so we have to think about it from that survival lens, and if we can think about it, we can have a little bit more compassion and say, "Okay, this is rooted in survival because we literally needed other people to survive, but now how do we challenge that and unlearn it a little bit?" So what I hear when you tell me this story is that your parents or whoever said this, right, made this up, that your husband was at work, is operating from that survival mindset, and that
Yeah.
because they're too scared and they believe that they're gonna be risking something if they tell the truth. That doesn't mean you have to then take that on and do it. You can say, "Okay, fine, I'm practicing discernment, and I'm saying it's fine, in this situation, it's not that big of a deal to me," but you might have a conversation with them later, or you might decide, "You know what? I don't wanna hide this anymore from the rest of the family." That's also a personal choice for you. But I think, what are other people gonna think? What are other people gonna say? That kind of management of other people's impressions of us, our reputation, that runs real deep in a lot of cultures.
Yeah, I mean, I think about when my parents moved to Canada in the 60s, my dad, cut his hair, stopped wearing a turban, started teaching at a Catholic school. And so he went to mass. And so when you talk about that surviving, is there something like that an immigration trauma?
Yeah.
And is that relevant? And should we be taking that into account?
Absolutely. I mean, this is basically 101 intergenerational trauma, right? The pain that's being passed down from generation to generation. I would imagine that your dad, just like my parents, probably witnessed his parents go through whatever they went through, right? My grandparents lived through the partition of 1947 of India. They were refugees who had to go across
Yeah.
the border. So if they're in survival for that, right? This is just two generations above me, then when they had kids, they probably weren't focused on emotional expression. They were probably just focused on the next thing. They were in survival mode. That affected the way they parented, which then affects the way my parents were raised, which affects the way they parented me. And there's this pain that's being passed down. That pain is maybe silence, stoicism, coping skills. Maybe it's drinking. Maybe it's other types of coping skills that might be hurting us. Whatever it is, right? Pain that can be passed down until someone says, "Huh, I'm gonna just take a second to think about where this comes from. Is this a cycle I wanna break? Is this something that I want to, like, do differently now?" And I think, I don't judge your dad for doing what he felt he needed to do to survive. Now, does that mean that you're in a situation where you have to hide parts of your identity to survive? It might feel like that inherently in your nervous system because you've learned that, but it doesn't mean it's the truth. So you get to decide now, maybe I have a little bit more privilege and ease to be, more to show more of my Indian side or to show up more as someone who is bicultural rather than someone who's assimilating. That's where the intergenerational cycle kind of develops and then is broken.
And so speaking of trauma, I know one way I used to cope with trauma was by drinking, right? And it was something I saw a lot growing up. So being Punjabi, it's like
Yeah.
there's drinking going on that seemed really normal. How, for you growing up, how did you see drinking? What role did it play?
Yeah, I mean, I'm Punjabi as well, and I grew up in a Punjabi household, and we went to community events every weekend, and alcohol is just a big part of it's deeply tied to everything, community gatherings, weddings, holidays, celebrations, anything. And so it was very normalized for alcohol to be a part of my life from a very young age. And my own dad drank, pretty consistently and heavy for a long time. A lot of the uncles did. It was just like it was very gendered and very tied to our culture.
So,
Yeah, and I think there is something to be said about it being a coping skill, right? Drinking, I believe, and I've worked with people who, I can't say I've worked with alcohol use and addiction, like, explicitly, but I've worked with people who have struggles or sometimes are looking to understand why they drink and why they use certain substances. And I've kind of come to believe in some ways of, working with other wellness practitioners in that space that drinking is never just a drink to many people. People don't just drink to drink. Like the drink has a meaning or has a purpose, right? Sometimes it's to cope, to numb the stress. Sometimes it's connection because it's a social, activity. Sometimes it's to escape, to temporarily forget something, to find peace. And sometimes it's pleasure because sometimes if we're really overstimulated, drinking will help bring us down and understimulate us a little bit, and it feels calming in a way. And so really understanding that is important because if we think about it from a culture, like if I take that back to what we're talking about, then I can understand that, wow, it was gendered, for me, for what I observed growing up. It was very much the men drinking in one room and the women in the other room, either cooking or sitting together. It was very gendered in that way that it was always the men getting drunk, that the women were okay with it. They were the designated drivers. It was like normalized. So I can then take what I've learned as a therapist and say, huh, I wonder if that's a numbness thing because they're all stressed at work and most of them were the primary providers, of their families. If that's connection, because this is the only way men know how to like be together and they're not really talking. So they're doing something together and that's like them connecting with each other. It's to numb their emotions because they've never learned how to express anger or sadness or fear or worry. And so they drink to be able to just not deal with those emotions. And I think that is where it clicks for me to understand maybe the why of it being a thing. But like you said, it's also very cultural. It's like very much embedded. We know back in Punjab, it was like if you looked at the villages in Punjab, just as we think about indigenous communities here, alcohol is like something to do in a lot of these places. There's
Mhm.
nothing else to do.
So if alcohol is something to do, I would say recovery is not. And even admitting that alcohol can be a problem, I've never seen anyone in my family acknowledge that. Like there's always the joke about like, the really drunk uncle, but no one's using the word alcoholic. No one's using the words like you should maybe seek treatment. My brother and I both identify as problem drinkers, and my parents are still like, "No, just have a glass. You can't have a glass of wine? No, we cannot have a glass of wine,
I believe
ma'am."
it. Yeah. Yeah.
So, how do you see or how have you seen through your clients addiction and recovery viewed? And what is that does that create a barrier to getting help?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I think it does create a barrier. I think the barrier is that there isn't language, right? In many of our families around addiction, around like, people might view it as like, oh, just have a stronger sense of will instead of it being like an actual mental health problem. It's like, oh, if you just tried harder, you wouldn't have to drink. If you just, you can control yourself. It's about our will, which leads to a lot of shame because then a lot of people who do struggle then say it's my fault. I'm not strong enough. I'm doing something wrong. And that becomes shame. We start to tie our sense of self and self-worth around the fact that we can't be better in some way. I think there's a lack of language around recovery and sobriety. I don't think that's a term I've ever heard in my community growing up of like, oh, this person's in recovery or this person's getting sober. I kind of vaguely have a memory of, like, someone in the community having to go to rehab, I think, and then everyone kind of whispered around it, but never really talked about it, and it was, like, shameful, but it was also, like, no one used the words, the right language, like, it was just kind of like, "He
Mhm.
went somewhere and he'll be back," like, very vague and, like, dressed in shame. And then I think there's a lot of, like, fear for people around seeking help because what does that mean? Like, going back to what are people gonna say? Like, am I gonna be ostracized from the community for having this problem or struggling in some way? Go with any mental health issue, right? I've seen it in the community of like, I'm weak or I'm not gonna belong anymore because I need help or I'm not strong enough or my family is not gonna lean on me anymore. My community is not going to include me anymore. And I think there's a lot of fear of that ostracization and like that lack of belonging. And then I think there's just systemic issues, right? I don't think like some of the programs and the I remember taking an alcohol like a substance use counseling class and we had to go to like AA meetings and different types of meetings and join just to be able to like see what our future clients might, do and what that looks like for them. And I remember thinking that a lot of it didn't feel culturally responsive, like recovery as it exists in a lot of the dominant spaces in the West is not culturally responsive. The language choice matters, right? So, like, I really think that for us to even talk about this in certain cultures, we need using culturally responsive language. We want to make sure that sobriety doesn't feel like assimilation, right? That you have to like think in some ways, some of the language I've heard from people who have gone to some of these programs has been like, well, I'm supposed to like, it's very individualistic focused in some ways. It's not like the families aren't involved or it's not about the relationships in some ways in the beginning. It feels very much like a individual centered experience. And for some people, that feels even less accessible because that's not how they actually think about things. And I think, where family and community are central to some people, we want to find ways to make recovery feel more culturally responsive in being able to integrate like how important those are to people, if that makes sense.
It does. So what does culturally sensitive recovery support look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are different things. I think there are ways to bring in, like, if I think about it from the lens of like working with anyone from a diverse background, I would encourage reclaiming cultural practices as a part of healing, right? So if someone is of a certain faith, bringing prayer and meditation into it, storytelling. A lot of cultures are really rich in different types of pop culture, drumming, food, dance, like just trying to find a way to incorporate these cultural practices as a part of recovery would be really important to me. And obviously, I would want to make sure the client felt invested in that. What's important to them? What is it that they, what do they use that feels grounding that might be very cultural in a certain way. I think integration again, so not stripping away culture at all. I think even exploring in the recovery process, what are these fears? How does culture play a role in the way they feel about their recovery? Because that helps them then address it, externalize it, acknowledge it, think about it, and then start to use that as part of their recovery process. So even naming it, saying like, oh, I have fear that my family is gonna look at me differently. I have fear that now a bad daughter for needing to go to a program or, get help in some way. Like, even talking about that is culturally responsive in a lot of ways. And then if I think language matters, just going back to that, right? Going back to the idea of boundaries, right? I think, we think about I just think language will matter, right? Duty is a big part of a lot of culture. I think for some people, trying to, uh if we try to make it sound if we try to bring in the boundary conversation, when I think of the word addiction, right? Like as you were saying, as I was saying, I don't hear people use that term. So I think if we were to talk to family members of people using words like imbalance or struggle or coping or something different, right? It doesn't mean we're ignoring the reality. It just might be language does that term doesn't feel accessible to maybe family and from a cultural lens. So even thinking about the word choice we use, I think is important.
Yeah, and so given that there's a lot of shame around addiction, I feel like there is also a lot of shame around mental
Yeah.
illness or any sort of mental health struggles. How does that manifest itself across cultures?
Shame is such a big part of it. It manifests as I think it's kind of a negative feedback loop, right? So you struggle with something, maybe you have a thought, I need help, or I want help, or I want something to change, even, or I don't want my life to be like this, whatever that thought is, that like leads to a little bit of like change talk. And then you immediately say, oh my God, I'm letting down my family, my parents, my partner, my kids. And then that reinforces kind of the coping skill, maybe, or the illness at play, right? Oh, you start to feel more depressed, you start to feel more anxious, you start to use alcohol more, and it's like almost this negative feedback loop. I think shame is a driver for a lot of the struggles that we have. Like I really do think it's like a prominent factor at play. Um, and I think that's the thing, right? I think that's compounded in collectivist cultures because of the family's reputation feeling at stake. So
Mhm.
when you come from a culture where the focus is community and the role you play and interdependence, when you struggle, it doesn't just feel like your struggle, it feels like you are letting down an entire collective. And that only amplifies the shame that people feel.
Yeah. What is decolonizing mental health practices mean to you?
It's a good question. I think it's hard to be someone who wants to decolonize mental health when I work within a system that, was is colonized in some way.
Yeah.
But I think decolonization is more about a practice of understanding that there isn't one way to be well, that talk therapy isn't the end all be all. Sometimes we have to be in our body, sometimes we have to use cultural practices. There are ancestral tools that have been around for centuries that we can rely on, right? We think about Ayurveda being a thing now in the Western world, but that's been around for a very long time. And so like we have to think about how do we actually reconnect with those ancestral, spiritual, cultural practices and tools that are either being commodified in the West or aren't even represented in the West at all. And that's where, like, I use the word cultural responsiveness, but that's where the cultural responsiveness comes from. How do we actually honor that every person comes from a background, comes from a family, comes from a culture that we need to invite into the room when we think about being well? Because that being well doesn't look the same for everyone. Your relationship with your parents might be, oh, my mom doesn't, yeah, I have a lot of privacy with my mom. I don't tell her things. My relationship with my mom might be a lot more open. And you might look at me and say, wow, that seems really unhealthy. But that's because you're assuming that your way of being in a relationship with your mom is the right way. And so decolonizing is challenging that and saying, actually, as individuals, we all get to decide what feels good to us, what we want to do to be well, what it means to be close to people, what it means to be in healthy relationships. That looks different for everyone because context matters.
Mhm. Yeah, and so one part of Indian culture especially is and you talked about a little bit about duty, right? And how do you when you have clients, how do you distinguish duty as love or coercion?
It's the biggest. Yep. That I have a whole podcast episode on that. When is duty like a source of love or when is it a tool for control? And
Yeah.
it's hard. I mean, there again, this is where a lot of self-reflection has to come in. We have to constantly ask ourselves, am I doing this out of fear or am I doing this because I feel choice? Right? So duty isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think we all have duty to each other, just generally as people. That's where community care comes in, where you care about your neighbor, where I will maybe go pick up lemons for my downstairs neighbor when I'm at the grocery store. Like, that's just a sense of responsibility to taking care of the people around you, being a part of a community, being a part of a family and a collective, right? That's choice. But when it feels like I have to do things in order to feel a sense of belonging, it's almost like you have to earn that belonging in some ways. That's when duty can feel really problematic and it can feel controlling because you're basically being told you have to be this version of yourself in order to be accepted here. And so that's when duty can feel like really unhealthy. So I think that the difference there is if the choices you're making are out of love and actual agency and autonomy, or if they're because you feel like you have to. Now, for some people, sometimes those get kind of mixed in together, right? Sometimes I might tell myself, like, it's been a while since I talked to my mom as a daughter, I should call her. And I'm making a choice to, but I'm also acknowledging, like, hey, I know my mom's probably wondering why I haven't called, so let me just call her. So I'm still taking action out of choice, but I'm also recognizing that it might be because of the duty that's been imposed on me as a daughter. And I'm opting in for that versus doing it because I feel like I have to, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Do you feel like kind of traditional therapy is more likely to see that as coercion?
I think they're more likely to push the like, if it doesn't feel good to you, then let's think about how you don't do this thing. And to be honest, I don't know any therapists who are like, I know we have this whole narrative online and in the Western world of like just cut people out who aren't good for you. I don't personally surround myself with therapists who would take that approach, but I know that there is messaging in the Western world of like, if it doesn't feel good, don't do it. And I think that's where it can become a problem of like, is the Western mental health world saying like taking on individualism to a hyper point where it's like, just focus on yourself. It doesn't matter if you hurt your parents' feelings. It doesn't matter if, this person doesn't agree. You should do what's best for you. I think that's when it becomes a problem because I do think we are all interdependent on each other. And sometimes we have to be inconvenienced. Sometimes we have to be uncomfortable. Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do. We just have to choose what those things are.
Is there ever a time that you recommend cutting people out or estrangement?
Uh,
Other than overt physical abuse or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I would never I'm not in the game of, like, recommending. I am never the expert on someone else's life. Like, that's how I operate as a therapist, which is why I'm so collaborative with my clients because I don't believe I know better than you. Maybe I have more expertise and I can guide you and I can ask you hard questions, I can challenge some things I'm noticing, I can point out observations, but I'm not gonna be someone who says, "No, you should do this," right? Because we all have agency and autonomy over our own life. I really believe in people's autonomy to make choices for themselves. Now, what do I see in the community? I have a whole episode on boundaries, low contact, no contact of my podcast
Mhm.
and people's stories of like how they tried boundary setting, it didn't work, so they started going low contact, which means like maybe you see your family less or you talk less or you decide how you want to engage in a way that feels good, but not all the time. And then some people said, I tried over and over again to have a conversation about how something or how the relationship doesn't feel good to me with a family member and I'm not getting anything in return, and now to protect myself, I can't have a relationship with them anymore. I don't think estrangement is always permanent. I think if people choose estrangement in their relationships, it's often a last resort. I don't believe anyone willingly is like, I don't care and I'm just gonna cut this person out because oftentimes it's a relationship you really care about. And so I think for someone to get to a point to say, I can't have a relationship right now means that they have tried really hard for a long time to make something work, and it is affecting them to the point of being really, bad for their mental health and for their, like, existence. And I will never judge someone for getting to that point.
Yeah, I am actually in a no contact right now. I have tried low contact, and that is unacceptable.
Yeah.
So, low contact is actually in my family, my mom and her siblings, my dad and his siblings, they are more likely to go no contact. That is a familiar place for them, whereas low contact feels like, "Why are you trying to be white? We're
It's all
not
or
gonna talk
nothing almost.
Yeah, they're like, I'm not gonna call you and talk about the weather.
Mhm.
I'm gonna call you and yell about something your brother did." And so, yeah, I'm currently in a no contact, but I agree, it doesn't have to be permanent, right? And so, how do you help people work through that temporary sort of estrangement and then getting back to without going back to where they started?
Well, it's hard, right? Because, we can't control how other people act or behave or choose to be in our relationship. So oftentimes, what is temporary estrangement may be longer than people want because the other person isn't willing to like put any work in, right? So you're basically trying to have a different relationship with someone who's not literally not changing or will not do something differently. So that's a hard place to be in. When it comes to like even exploring or being in a no contact situation, oftentimes that work is about grief, right? There's a lot of grief work of the relationship you don't have that you wish you had, the relationship you didn't have that you wished you had, the relationship you won't have that you wish you would have in the future. So lots of grief work in being able to even get to a point where you can live with that choice, right? I know it's really hard for people. I know people who are no contact and it's it's painful. It's
It's
one of the
excruciating.
most painful experiences. And then, of course, building up that chosen community, that those places of corrective relational experiences, those places where you feel safe and welcomed and witnessed and validated and a sense of belonging. And depending on your background and cultural identities, I work with a lot of children of immigrants. Sometimes it's finding those spaces to connect with other people who share in your cultural identities because now you don't have access to that identity through your family anymore. So you're looking for that elsewhere. You want to still feel that sense of connection, but you're looking to figure out who can you get that from. So finding those community spaces is really important. And then of course it's just like a lot of the work is just having that sense of permission to yourself to be able to take care of yourself. Uh, When you cut someone else off, especially if it's a parent, there's a lot of reparenting work, a lot of like being able to give to yourself what you're not getting and what you will not get from that person.
That is really true. How do you help people? So for me, I struggle with this every day, and I don't have a brown therapist to help me with it, but I have such a huge amount of embarrassment and guilt over the no contact. And so I find this especially because I've been like attempting to date. And especially when I'm talking to an Indian guy, it is hard to say, I haven't talked to my parents in X number of months. How do you help people work through that sort of embarrassment, shame, guilt over a no contact or low contact type situation?
Well, my first question, not to turn this into a pseudo therapy session, would
Yeah.
be like, what do you think it says about you to other people who
Yes.
don't have a relationship with your parents?
Yeah, it says I'm a terrible person, right? And that is exactly, yeah, that is how I feel. Like that's the narrative I think other people have is that, oh my gosh, like what kind of selfish, disloyal kind of person would, you know, cut off contact with their aging parents? Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so, I would probably like be a little paradoxical here and be like, well, if you don't want to be selfish, then have a relationship with them. What does that look like? What would that feel like to you to have a relationship with them?
Yeah, it's not even like a possibility because there is like there's a betrayal situation going on. Obviously, my co-host is my ex-sister-in-law.
Mhm.
They're not thrilled about that. So, yeah, right now it doesn't seem possible.
Yeah.
It seems like it may be one day.
Okay. So it's not that it's you're selfishly going no contact, it's that there's actually
No.
no possibility. Okay, so you just changed your tune from like 1 minute to the next of being like, I feel like it makes me selfish, but then you're saying, no, it's not selfish actually. Well, that's the
I
point.
feel like it looks
It looks
selfish.
selfish. So
Even though I have come to terms with it is probably the healthiest situation, like,
yeah.
a situation for everyone,
Yeah.
and I've tried, like and I've gone back a number of times and, like, always around the holidays, I try, and it ends up in the same place,
Yeah.
but yeah.
That's where a lot of my clients are too, and that's where discernment really is so important because a really hard truth for everyone, me included, is that there are going to be people who misunderstand you and who have a narrative that you are selfish, that you are a bad kid. It is just
Mhm.
there will always be at least one person who has the narrative of us that we don't want them to have of us. Because people will talk and they will always find something to talk about. People are always creating stories based off of their own lived experiences. So if someone looks at
Mhm.
you and hears something about you and automatically makes an assumption about it, that is rooted in their belief system and their own experiences more than it's really about you. And so this is where discernment matters because you are dating people who you are looking to share a life with.
Mhm.
That point, you then get to decide, is this someone I actually want to tell the whole story to or parts of the story to so they can understand it? And if they judge me for that, isn't that just a sign that this is not the person I can share my life with?
My therapist says the Cliff Notes version
Yeah.
is yeah, she's like, "Does the Cliff Notes version sound to your ears pretty terrible?" Yeah, Cliff Notes version does, but when somebody hears the whole story, it's, like, very understandable.
Yeah. And I
So
don't know that I would wanna surround myself with people who hear a version of something and don't have questions and instead are just like, "Well, you're a bad person, I'm writing you off."
yeah, I agree. So, in cultures like ours that romanticize the idea of sacrifice, how do we prioritize self-care, and how do you help people do that? Like, I don't think I ever saw my mom do any self-care growing up, and it took a toll, for sure.
Yeah, so we have to understand what self-care even is, from a cultural standpoint point. You might not have seen your mom engage in self-care, but I would argue she probably did engage in self-care. Her self-care might have been going to some of those community events and sitting in a room with other aunties and sitting and talking. That might have been self-care for her. It might have been, cooking when the whole family is together after everyone's off at college or away, and, like, that might feel like self-care to her is, like, the act of preparing food, giving food, being able to play that role that feels good to her in some ways, getting together with the community prayer might have been self-care. And so we have to kind of rethink that self-care just looks different for everyone and people are engaging in it in ways that feel right to them in the ways that they know how. Because not everyone has language for it, right? I'd probably argue your mom never used the word self-care, but she still did things to help herself
Yeah.
feel better, whatever they were. Maybe she cried in the closet when no one was looking. We don't know. Like, we don't know what her version of self-care was. And so I wouldn't say that she never did it. I would say that you didn't see it in the way that you understand it for yourself.
Uh,
And so I think, when we think about cultural self-care, we can frame it. So I wholeheartedly believe that self-care is a form of community care. We have to be our best versions of ourselves to be a part of communities and to be interdependent with other people. And community care is a form of self-care in that we need other people. Like our healing is never done in isolation, ever. And so if we understand that, then there's two forms of self-care. There's how being with other people, being connected to other people, feeling seen and a sense of belonging with other people that helps us feel good about ourselves. And then there's the like, what do we need to do on the day to day to proactively just set us up and help us feel good about ourselves. Now, I want to be very clear here that self-soothing and self-care are very different. Self-soothing is like the reactive, I'm overwhelmed, I'm stressed, I don't feel good. What do I do in this moment to take care of myself? Some people drink, some people shop, some people binge Netflix, some people go outside for a run, a walk, listen to music, whatever it is. Some of it's healthier than others, but we find ways to ground ourselves when we are feeling activated. Then self-care is the more like privileged, future focused. So your mom probably engaged in self-soothing. She might not have had the time or the wherewithal or the emotional understanding to do real self-care. Real self-care is how do I do the hard things to set myself up? How do I go to the dentist appointment I don't want to go to? How do I have that hard conversation? How do I set that boundary in a way that feels hard for me? And we can reframe self-care from a cultural lens to say, that helps me show up better in these roles. I need to do this for myself in order to be a better daughter, to be a better partner, to be a better parent. I am better to the people I care about when I take care of myself. So I think even that reframe can help us then say, okay, how do I make time for this?
I love that. I love that. I hadn't even thought about it that way. So, on that positive note, what is new with you and brown girl therapy? What should we be looking out for?
Ah, yes. Well, I've got lots of stuff that are steady. My book is out. You can buy that anywhere. It's called But What Will People Say? I have a newsletter called Culturally Enough, podcast that has a first season that is out called So We've Been Told, and then the Instagram account, Brown Girl Therapy. I am working on a couple offerings for people who love us. So I am working on a newsletter for therapists to be more culturally responsive in their care. So stay tuned for that. I have a few community programs for the community coming out that are on my website, which is just my name, Sahaj Kaur Kohli. And then potentially a second book that I will not share about, but I am currently in the process of thinking about.
Okay, well, you have to come back when that book is
Okay.
conceptualized. Thank you so much, Sahaj, for coming on. I know I learned a lot. Thank you for the therapy that I didn't have to pay for, and I had therapy today. So thanks
Great.
for the second
You're
session.
welcome.
And thank you all for listening to Sisters in Sobriety, and we'll see you next week.